Welcome back to Session 5 of Mood Matters. This session we will look at more common behaviours that keep the vicious circle of depression going. We will be focusing on the habits of avoidance, putting it off and rumination, and how we can start to break the vicious circle by problem solving. But first, let's review the tasks you might have carried out from last session. If you used your thought diaries this week, were they helpful? Did you notice any thoughts that came up often? And did any of your thoughts stop or prevent you from working towards your goals? You may wish to reflect on these questions on your own or within a group. We are shifting our focus slightly this session, as it's important to think about obstacles such as avoidance that make changing your behaviour more difficult. This way you can easily spot when and if these obstacles are occurring. The idea is that understanding yourself more will help you on the path to overcoming low mood and getting the life that you want. Avoidance is a powerful habit. You may wish to look at the sheet labelled Leslie's example to understand this better. If you choose to read Leslie's example, take a moment to reflect on the different aspects of Leslie's avoidance patterns. How were they helpful to her, and how were they unhelpful to her? Avoidance can be a tricky thing to identify. For example, many people enjoy a long lie at the weekend, but lying in bed on a Saturday morning might be considered avoidance if the reason is that you don't want to get up and face the day. Some behaviour might not look like avoidance, such as knitting in Leslie's case, but given the context, may not be so helpful. Avoidance is defined as the substitution of behaviours that cause discomfort or anxiety for behaviours that bring relief from distress, or put simply, the coping behaviours that we naturally default to when we feel anxious or out with our safe zone. Avoidance can help you temporarily escape difficult feelings, but may not be so helpful in the long run. In Session 3, we spoke about avoidance and escape as a natural and instinctive response to depression. It might help to know that there is a biological explanation for this. This explanation lies in an evolutionary response called fight or flight. Fight or flight is a natural biological response that has been part of animal behaviour for thousands of years and has helped us to survive all sorts of dangers. However, in today's world, we are not at threat from other animals and predators, but depression has a way of making things that normally wouldn't trouble you seem threatening. For example, getting out of bed in the morning might raise the threat that you will feel even worse. You can see how this natural tendency to avoid perceived threats can either help or hinder you depending upon the situation. Avoidance is usually not intentional. When people are depressed, they don't think to themselves, I'm going to do everything I can to avoid things that make me feel uncomfortable. The process is much more subtle and automatic. You might not even notice it. You may wish to read the sheet labelled Alan's example to help you better understand the subtlety of avoidance. In this example, Alan did not develop an avoidance habit intentionally. It developed on its own because it was a helpful way of temporarily reducing his feelings of distress and despair about writing. The same is true with many of the avoidance strategies you might use when you're depressed. Take a moment to think back on a recent situation where you intended to do something you knew may have a positive impact on your depression, but instead you ended up doing just the opposite. It could be that you were heading to meet a friend, but instead turned back and went home or called with an excuse to cancel. Or, rather than completing something you needed to do, you spent a whole afternoon just thinking about it and putting it off. Take a minute to write down an activity you have been trying to accomplish and list all the things that seem to get in the way of accomplishing it. If you choose to do this, consider if these things gave you relief from feelings of anxiety or pressure. Or were they common avoidance tactics like watching television or having a snack? We will now consider a number of situations and activities that people with depression often avoid. Use the worksheet labelled A Checklist of Avoidant Behaviours to help you with this. Read through the list and notice if you identify with any of them. Consider why you might be avoiding these activities. There is also room to add in some more examples of your own. So how do we develop avoidance? Well, avoidance is learned through experience. One bad experience can make you very cautious in similar situations. Think of the expression once bitten, twice shy. Avoidance gives us quick relief from uncomfortable feelings in the short term. Think back to Leslie's example when going for a lie down meant that she didn't have to face the overwhelming prospect of doing the big pile of laundry. Because it provides us with such relief, it appears to be a good strategy to make yourself feel better. So what's wrong with avoidance? Even though avoidance can feel like the best option in many situations, it prevents you from taking steps towards solving life's problems or improving the way you feel. In the long term, avoidance can continue to produce anxiety and worry because problems remain unsolved or they could get worse. Think again about Leslie's example. It was a vicious circle. I'm waiting until I feel better is a common way that people with low mood or anxiety fall into the avoidance trap. It is recommended that you don't try to get rid of or block bad feelings, but that you stop letting the way you feel dictate what you are doing. Further types of avoidance are procrastination, that is, putting things off until later. You might find yourself saying, "I'll do it tomorrow." Rumination is another common type of avoidance, that is, spending too much time thinking about how you're feeling and becoming stuck in the same negative thinking loop. And finally, numbing or zoning out of problems by using drugs or alcohol could also be considered as avoidance. We will start to look at how we can overcome avoidance. Overcoming avoidance involves coming up with alternative coping methods. These methods involve being active rather than avoidant. However, it's not about rushing in head first and trying to do everything at once. Again, it's important to take things one step at a time and gradually build up to taking on more difficult challenges. You might find it helpful to use the worksheet labelled Worksheet 1 to help you plan out new coping methods. Pick an avoidance behaviour that you identified earlier, list its consequences, brainstorm all possible alternative behaviours that you can think of, then pick one and plan to put it into action. It could be helpful for you to schedule it into your activity tracker for the coming week. Now we come on to talk about worry. It's common to spend a lot of time worrying about the way you feel and the situation you're in when you're depressed. Like avoidance, worry is natural, but will lead you to feel worse as it fuels the vicious circle of depression. What we're trying to emphasise is that it's not always necessary to try and change what you're thinking about when you're depressed, nor do you need to get into arguments with yourself about thinking more positively. It could be helpful just to understand what your thinking is doing for you at the time. Ask yourself, is it helping me to feel less depressed? Or, am I even aware that I'm doing it? And, what else could I be doing? Here are some of the common things you might think about when you're depressed. You can see how this type of thinking can turn into a depression loop. Try not to get caught up in what you're thinking, but ask yourself why you're doing it and try to distract yourself. When you worry, you can get caught up in the habit of ruminating. We use the word rumination to describe when people think things over again and again. Here are some of the telltale signs that can help you spot if you are ruminating. When you go over things in your mind, even though they upset you or make you feel down. You might feel like you're unable to stop thinking about these things. You might feel a bit like a stuck record. You might replay arguments or conversations you've had with people constantly. Or you might have a tendency to brood over mistakes that you've made in the past. If you recognise yourself in this, the next time you think you might be ruminating, stop and ask yourself the following. Have I made any progress towards solving my problem? Do I understand something about the problem that I haven't understood before now? And do I feel less self-critical or less depressed than before I started thinking about this? If the answer is no to these questions, then the chances are you're ruminating. Many people believe that rumination is helpful to them. There are beliefs that thinking deeply about problems is the best way to solve them, or that digging deep can uncover your true feelings. There are also beliefs that to overcome depression, we must understand the root cause, or that mulling problems over helps us to understand them better. Although these are common beliefs, what research actually suggests is that ruminating can put people at risk of depression, and it stops us from being able to take steps to solve problems relating to depression. So if rumination stops us from seeing ways to solve problems, taking a problem-solving approach does the exact opposite. Let's take a closer look at what problem-solving is. There are 8 steps involved in the problem-solving process. We will look at each one in detail over the next few slides. Step 1 is to clearly state the problem. Poor examples are ones that are vague. For instance, this house gets me down. Try to be as specific as you can. Instead, you might reframe it as, the dampness in the back room is getting worse. In the next slide, you will hear an example of a problem Sam is facing in his life. Then, in the 2 slides after that, you will hear Sam working through the steps 2 and 3 of the problem-solving process.
Do you know, looking back, I just think I've been depressed forever. I mean, I can remember, I can go right back to primary school. I can remember never feeling happy, always feeling down. It's followed me throughout my life. And when I look back on it, I think a big thing was to do with my dad. The truth is, my dad didn't bother about me. Never bothered about me. We never did anything together. He never showed me any affection. He wasn't bad to me, I'd have to say. I mean, almost if he had been bad, that would have helped, because at least he would have been showing some interest in me. I was ignored, I think, and other people think that that's the case as well. Anyway, why this is important is I think that's been a major reason for me being depressed over the course of my life, right? I'm a grown man now, I'm not blaming anyone, but I think if I'd had a better start in life, it would have been easier. The situation now is I've got a 9-year-old boy, wee John, and when John was born, I swore that I was going to be a good father to him, that I would not be like my dad was to me. How could I? If I'm saying that the reason why my life's been miserable is at least in part due to my dad, then obviously I'm going to do better with my son. I'm not going to condemn him to feeling the way I feel about life. Well, great words, but the reality is my son's now 9 years old. We barely do anything together. We barely talk to each other. I don't think he hates me. I think he's kind of realised that I'm useless, that I'm not going to help him in any way, and I think the easiest way he finds to go through life is kind of to forget me, and that's exactly what I did with my dad. And I tell you, that makes me feel so guilty. It makes me feel so depressed that I'm condemning my son to a life like mine. So I've got a major problem here, and wee John's got a major problem as well. But the problem, if I want to put it into a sentence, is my son John has no time for me now. I think it'll be the same as me and my dad. I used to think he was the greatest. and I ended up hating him. He was never there when things were bad. He was never someone you could rely on in any way. And even when things were good, you couldn't share the good times with him either, because he just didn't seem interested, or he just wasn't there. And I've thought long and hard about this. And what I think is that as he never spent time with me, he made me feel as if I was no use, as if I wasn't important. I can't let that happen with my son. I feel as guilty as hell that I'm not the father I dearly want to be. And that guilt sits heavy on me every day of my life. And if I thought I was doing the right thing by my wee boy, maybe it would start to get rid of the guilt. And maybe I would think I was a better person than I am now. The wife might gain some respect for me. I doubt she has much just now. And, maybe that would help us both.
Now that Sam has worked through steps 1, 2 and 3, step 4 is to brainstorm all the ways he could potentially solve his problem. Sam thought of a range of ways to solve his problem. Take a moment to read through his list. You will notice that some options he has thought about are better than others. The point of brainstorming is not only to think of the good options, it is about thinking of all the options, good and bad. Once Sam has listed all his options, he can start to weigh up the pros and cons. This will help him to decide which options are best. Take a moment to look at the pros and cons Sam has thought about for option 1. And for option 2, and the same for option 3. And again for option 4. And for option 5. And lastly for option 6. Step 5 is about choosing the best option for you. In Sam's case, he decided the best solutions for solving his problem based on the pros and cons of each. In the next slide, we hear Sam talk through step 6, which is to work out a plan.
My wife asked John if he fancied going fishing. And she said he was dead keen and said he missed going with his dad because we used to do it in the past. Well, that lets me get up the courage to do it. So I'm going to speak to him after our tea tonight. We'll get out the rods to check them over. I'll meet him from school on Friday. We'll go to the shop and get bait. We'll pack up the gear Friday night. The two of us will do all of this together. And I'm going to invite my mate to come along with us. I've told him what I'm trying to do, and he's good. He knows I might be stressed out of my box, but he's good at keeping me calm. And he'll bring his son, and he gets on well with my boy. We'll be quiet when we're fishing, so that's less pressure on me. I'm not going to expect it to be perfect, but if John wants, we'll do it again the next Saturday I'm off. And I'm going to do some relaxation in the morning, and I'm not going to drink the night before.
Now that Sam has a clear plan in mind, he now needs to take step 7, which is put it into action. Once you've taken step 7, move on to step 8, which is review. In the next slide, we hear how Sam got on with his action plan, and he reviews the good and bad bits.
Well, it's rained all day and we caught nothing. Right, that put a bit of a dampener on things. I spent too much time talking to my mate, not enough time talking to John. At one point I shouted at him for spilling the bait. I shouldn't have done that. He's only a wee boy. It's only bait, for goodness sake. Right, those are the bad things. But I can learn from this and not make the same mistakes next time. But on the plus side, John said he had a good time. And he wanted to know if we could do it again. Just, I think he was wary to ask me in case I got angry or something. But I said yes, and I told him I had a good time being with him. And I did. I really did. My wife's pleased, but she wants to see signs that I'll keep it up. Fair enough. On the whole, I'm pleased with how it went. I've taken a step forward.
Reviewing is a very important step in the problem-solving process. A good review means thinking about how things have gone in an honest, realistic and balanced way. You might ask yourself, did it work? If it didn't, then why not? What did I learn? Can I improve it to make it work? Once you have answered these questions in a balanced way without being too negative, you can then think about what your next step is, or what the next problem you could tackle is. We have reached the end of session 5. Take some time to reflect on the points made in today's session and consider using the strategies outlined. Over the next week, you might consider setting yourself some homework, like choosing a straightforward problem and working through the 8-step process. You might also continue to use activity tracker sheets to identify problem areas in your life. Next session, we can take some time to reflect on how you found these tasks. In session 6, we will look at something called mood dependence and the role it plays in depression. We'll also cover ways that we can overcome mood dependence by setting goals for ourselves.